It became official in a way no headline could soften. An arrest was made, and suddenly a story that lived online crossed into a courtroom. For months, people watched videos, shared links, donated money, and argued in comment sections about who was helping and who was hurting. Now, the question has shifted from opinion to accountability. Authorities say this case is no longer about misunderstanding or internet drama. It is about alleged exploitation, fraud, and the use of vulnerability as leverage. According to law enforcement, Patrick Roark was taken into custody in January 2026 after a state-level investigation tied to donations and goods collected in the name of the Whittaker family. This arrest didn't come from a viral backlash or online pressure alone. It came after investigators began tracing money, access, and control behind the scenes. And the charges they announced changed the tone of everything. Authorities allege that this was not a single mistake or a poorly handled fundraiser. They describe a pattern: multiple counts, repeated actions, a system that, if proven in court, relied on the image of help while operating in a way that benefited someone other than the people being shown. What makes this case different from so many internet scandals is who sits at the center of it. The Whittaker family were not influencers. They were not entrepreneurs. They were not public figures seeking attention. They were a vulnerable family living in isolation, with members described as cognitively impaired, nonverbal, elderly, and dependent on routine and familiarity. According to investigators, that vulnerability is exactly why this case exists. The charges outlined by authorities include multiple felony counts related to financial exploitation of an incapacitated person, fraudulent schemes, and fraudulent use of an access device. These are not symbolic charges. They reflect allegations that donations meant to help a vulnerable family were instead routed in ways that investigators say never benefited them at all. For many people watching this unfold, there's a sense of betrayal layered on top of shock. Viewers believed they were contributing to something good. They believed their money would bring food, repairs, safety, or stability. And now they are being asked to confront the possibility that their compassion may have been redirected into something else entirely. Investigators allege that donations were solicited over a period of months during the height of online attention. They say money was sent through personal accounts, personal mailing addresses, and payment methods controlled by one individual. According to the allegations, the Whittakers did not receive those funds. Not partially, not eventually, not indirectly. That claim is central to why the case has been charged the way it has. This is where the story becomes bigger than one arrest. Because if these allegations are proven, it exposes a pattern that can repeat anywhere. A vulnerable family becomes visible. An outsider steps in as a helper. The internet responds with sympathy and donations. And without safeguards, without transparency, without oversight, that goodwill can be redirected quietly while the family remains exactly where they started. While all of this was unfolding, something else happened that many people didn't fully understand at the time. Adult Protective Services intervened. 3 members of the Whittaker household were removed from the home and placed into state care. That decision, according to public reporting, came amid growing concerns about safety, living conditions, and vulnerability. The timing matters. The alleged financial exploitation and the state intervention are not separate stories. They are overlapping consequences of a situation that spiraled under the weight of attention, money, and outside involvement. What's left now is a family fractured. Some members in state care, others still living in the original home, and a criminal case that continues to develop in real time. The investigation is described as ongoing, which means more information may surface and more accountability may follow. This is the moment where viewers have to slow down and reframe how they engage with stories like this. Because the most dangerous thing about exploitation dressed as charity is how easy it is to believe you're doing the right thing. Most people who donated did so out of empathy, not greed. And that's exactly why these cases matter so much. As this legal process continues, one thing is already clear. When vulnerability becomes content, the risk of exploitation increases. And when help is offered without structure, without transparency, and without protection for the people at the center, the harm can outlast the attention. This story is no longer about rumors or personalities. It is about what happens when compassion is targeted, monetized, and allegedly misused. And in the next part, we're going to look closely at how authorities say the alleged scheme operated, how the money was moved, and why investigators believe the Whittakers themselves were left behind in the fallout. Before you move on, take a moment and think about this. When you see a charity story online, what would make you stop and verify before you give? Comment below and share your thoughts. To understand why this case escalated from online controversy to felony charges, you have to follow the path authorities say the money took. Not the emotional story that played out on screens, but the quieter paper trail investigators claim tells a very different version of events. According to information released after the arrest, law enforcement alleges that donations connected to the Whittaker family began flowing months before the public realized how large the operation had become. The window investigators focused on stretches from late spring into early fall of 2025, right when attention around the family surged. Videos circulated. Lives were streamed. Sympathy grew fast. And with that sympathy came money. Authorities allege those donations were not handled through any registered nonprofit, trust, or safeguarded charity account. Instead, they say funds were directed into personal payment platforms and personal mailing addresses controlled by Patrick Roark. That detail matters more than most people realize, because once money enters a personal account, it loses the protections that exist in legitimate charitable structures. There is no automatic oversight, no requirement for public accounting, no built-in barrier to misuse. Investigators allege that more than $10,000 was collected through these channels during that time period. That figure is not presented as an estimate pulled from rumor. It comes from transaction records reviewed by law enforcement. And according to the allegations, the most damning part isn't the amount. It's what didn't happen next. Police allege the Whittakers did not receive those funds. Not for food, not for repairs, not for relocation, not for medical needs. The money, investigators claim, stayed with the person who solicited it. That allegation is the foundation of the financial exploitation charges, because the family members at the center of the fundraising were not in a position to monitor, manage, or even fully understand the financial arrangements being made in their name. This is where the language of the charges becomes important. Financial exploitation of an incapacitated person isn't about someone making a bad choice with their own money. It's about taking advantage of someone who cannot reasonably protect themselves from harm. Investigators say the Whittaker family included individuals who were nonverbal, cognitively impaired, elderly, or otherwise dependent on others for care and decision-making. That vulnerability is not incidental. It is central to the case. Authorities allege the fundraising relied on portraying the family's living conditions and hardships in ways that generated urgency and emotional response. The public was told their money would help, that it would change lives, that it would fix what the world had ignored for decades. And according to investigators, while donors believed they were helping the Whittakers, the structure of the operation allowed one person to maintain full control over the money. This is where many viewers begin to feel uncomfortable, because it forces a hard question. If donations were not reaching the family, then what exactly was the content doing? Who was it helping? And why did it continue even as conditions on the ground failed to improve? Law enforcement also alleges that goods donated for the Whittakers followed a similar pattern. Items meant for the family were allegedly intercepted, redirected, or kept. That claim expands the scope of the case beyond digital transactions. It suggests a broader system of control where access to the family, their story, and the resources meant for them are filtered through a single gatekeeper. And that's why this case isn't being treated as a misunderstanding. Investigators aren't alleging sloppy bookkeeping or confusion. They are alleging intent, a scheme, a repeated pattern of behavior where vulnerability was leveraged for personal gain. While all of this was happening, the family itself remained in the same deteriorating environment. The house did not suddenly become safer. Repairs were not completed. Long-term solutions did not materialize. And eventually, Adult Protective Services intervened. That intervention didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of heightened attention, outside involvement, and alleged financial irregularities. When APS removed 3 family members from the home, it wasn't because the internet cared too much. It was because the situation had become unsafe enough that the state believed it had to act. This is one of the most painful ironies of the entire story. While money was allegedly being raised in the family's name, the conditions that justified removal were still present. That disconnect is what investigators are now examining. Because if resources had been properly used, the trajectory might have been different. For donors, this realization can be devastating. Many people gave because they felt a responsibility, because they saw something wrong and wanted to help fix it. Now they're being asked to reckon with the possibility that their generosity was misdirected. Authorities have asked anyone who donated through Patrick Roark or sent goods believing they were meant for the Whittakers to come forward. That request alone tells you how seriously this is being taken. Law enforcement does not make public calls like that lightly. It suggests they are still piecing together the full scope of what happened and how many people were affected. It's also important to be clear about what has and has not been charged at this point. As of now, the felony charges announced publicly are against Patrick Roark. The investigation itself has been described as ongoing. That means additional findings could emerge, but it also means conclusions should not be rushed. Accountability takes time. What cannot be ignored, however, is the pattern this case exposes. Vulnerable families do not need attention alone. They need protection. They need systems that prevent exploitation before it happens, not reactions after the damage is done. This is the moment where the internet has to look inward. Because this didn't grow in the dark. It grew in plain sight. Views rewarded the content. Engagement amplified it. Donations followed visibility. And without safeguards, that combination can become dangerous very quickly. The collapse of this alleged scheme didn't just leave donors feeling betrayed. It left a family divided, placed in state care, and surrounded by silence. That is the real cost of exploitation disguised as help. In the next part, we're going to focus on what happened to the Whittakers themselves during and after this collapse. How state intervention changed their lives, what is known, what remains sealed, and why the aftermath is often harder than the exposure. Before you move on, ask yourself this and answer honestly. If someone online claims to be helping a vulnerable person, what proof would you need before you trust them? Leave your thoughts in the comments. While the investigation into alleged financial exploitation was unfolding behind the scenes, the lives of the Whittaker family were already shifting in ways that could not be undone. This is the part of the story that rarely gets the same attention as arrests or charges, but it is the part that carries the most weight. Because once state intervention begins, the consequences ripple outward long after the cameras stop rolling and the fundraising links disappear. By late September 2025, Adult Protective Services stepped in. 3 members of the Whittaker household were removed from the property. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy. For decades, the family had lived together in isolation, relying on routine, familiarity, and each other to survive. That routine, however fragile, was the only structure they had ever known. And then, in a matter of days, it was gone. The removal did not come with a public explanation. That silence wasn't accidental. Adult protective cases are governed by confidentiality laws designed to prevent exploitation, retaliation, and further harm. The same rules that protect vulnerable adults from being turned into public spectacles also prevent outsiders from receiving detailed updates. Even family members are often told very little, and that is where the emotional fracture deepened. Betty and Larry remained in the house. The same house the world had watched for years. But now it held fewer voices, fewer movements, and fewer answers. According to those close to the situation, they were not told where their relatives were taken. They were not given timelines. They were not given reassurance in a way that felt human. What they were given was silence. That silence can be protective in theory. In practice, it is brutal. Imagine living your entire adult life, caring for your siblings, your relatives, your household, and then being told you're no longer allowed to see them, speak to them, or even know where they are. Not because you did something malicious, but because the system has decided the environment is unsafe and cannot risk continued exposure. This is where public opinion often splits into 2 camps. One side sees protection. They see clean environments, regulated meals, medical oversight, and professional care. The other side sees punishment. They see separation, confusion, trauma, and the loss of the only life these individuals ever understood. The truth is that both can exist at the same time. For Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, state care likely meant stability they never had. Regular food, heat that doesn't depend on one stove, hygiene support, medical evaluations, structure. That matters. It matters more than most people want to admit because it forces us to confront a hard reality. Love alone is not always enough to keep people safe. But for Betty and Larry, the outcome was something else entirely. Their world collapsed inward. The house became too large, too quiet, too heavy. And while the internet moved on to the next headline, they were left sitting in the aftermath of a decision they didn't control and may never fully understand. This is the hidden cost of viral compassion. When attention floods in without safeguards, it doesn't just create opportunity for exploitation. It also accelerates state scrutiny. Once agencies are involved, they do not simply leave because the internet loses interest. They monitor, they document, they wait. And when thresholds are crossed, they act decisively. What's important to understand is that APS does not remove adults lightly. Removal is considered a last resort. It typically follows documented concerns about safety, neglect, self-neglect, or inability to provide adequate care. And once removal happens, returning someone to the same environment is extremely rare unless significant, verifiable changes are made. That means the future for the Whittakers is no longer something the family alone can decide. It is now governed by assessments, court oversight, and legal standards. And that shift is permanent. The fraud investigation and the APS intervention are not separate stories. They intersect because when outsiders insert themselves into vulnerable households, especially with cameras and money involved, the risk multiplies. The family becomes exposed not only to exploitation, but to scrutiny that may lead to separation. This is the part many donors never consider. Giving money to an unregulated individual doesn't just risk theft. It can destabilize an already fragile situation. It can attract attention that overwhelms a household. It can invite promises that can't be kept. And when those promises fail, the family is left dealing with the fallout. In 2026, The Whittakers are living with that fallout. Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy are somewhere under state care, protected by confidentiality and removed from public access. Betty and Larry remain in the house, aging, isolated, and waiting for information that may never come in the way they hope. There is no reunion montage coming. There is no simple resolution. This is not a story that ends with everyone sitting back on the porch together. The system does not work that way. Once it intervenes, it prioritizes safety over sentiment, even when that decision causes pain. That reality makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It should, because it exposes a truth we don't like to face. When vulnerable families become content, the damage doesn't stop when the views stop. It continues quietly, legally, and irreversibly. And now, as the criminal case against Patrick Roark moves forward, the Whittakers are left navigating a world where trust has been broken on every level. Trust in outsiders, trust in promises, trust in help that arrived with strings attached. In the next part, we're going to talk about what this case means beyond one family, how it changes the way we should think about online charity, viral advocacy, and the responsibility viewers carry when they engage with stories of suffering. Before you go on, take a moment and answer this honestly. If protection requires silence, how much silence is too much? Leave your thoughts in the comments. What happens after the arrest is the part most people never see. Not because it's hidden on purpose, but because it's slow, procedural, and emotionally exhausting. Court dates, motions, paperwork, silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace, but like waiting in a room where no one tells you what's going to happen next. With Patrick Roark now formally charged, the legal system has taken control of one piece of the Whittaker story. But the family itself is no longer at the center of that process. They are not decision makers. They are evidence of harm. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Criminal cases don't exist to restore families. They exist to determine guilt, responsibility, and punishment. Even if every allegation is proven, even if convictions follow, the outcome will not rewind time. It will not reunite the household. It will not undo the trauma of separation. At best, it may prevent the same pattern from repeating with another vulnerable family. This is where the internet often gets it wrong. People assume justice means repair, that accountability equals healing. But those are different things handled by different systems with different priorities. The justice system asks, was a crime committed, and by whom? The protective system asks, is this environment safe, and if not, what must change? In the Whittaker case, both systems are now in motion, and they don't wait for each other. The fraud charges focus on money, misrepresentation, and exploitation. They are backward-looking. They examine what happened, how funds were moved, and whether intent can be proven. The APS actions, however, are forward-looking. They focus on risk, vulnerability, and future harm. And once APS decides a risk is too high, it does not need a criminal conviction to act. That's why some people are confused. They ask, if Patrick is arrested, doesn't that mean the family can go back to normal? But normal no longer exists. The conditions that triggered intervention were not created by one person alone. They were the result of decades of isolation, poverty, neglect, and then sudden exposure amplified by the internet. Removing one alleged exploiter does not magically stabilize a fragile household, especially not one with elderly adults, cognitive impairments, and a property already described as hazardous. This is the uncomfortable truth of 2026. The Whittakers are no longer living in a story driven by viewers. They're living inside systems that do not answer to public opinion. And those systems move quietly. Guardianship evaluations, capacity assessments, environmental inspections, medical reviews, Each one produces documentation that becomes part of a permanent record, and each one pushes the future in a particular direction, a direction that often ends with supervised living, managed care, or permanent placement away from the original home. For Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, that direction may already be set. Once adults are removed and stabilized in care, returning them to a previously unsafe environment is rare. The threshold for reversal is high. It requires proof of sustained improvement, structural changes, and ongoing support. Not promises, not intentions. Proof. For Betty and Larry, the situation is even more precarious. They remain in the house, but under watch, aging, isolated, and now living with the psychological weight of being separated from the people who gave their days meaning. This is where grief becomes complicated. It isn't just missing someone, it's missing a role. Betty's identity was built around caregiving, around being needed, around holding the family together. When that role is removed by force, it leaves a void that no legal explanation can fill. Larry's experience appears different, but no less heavy. Reports suggest a heightened fear of speaking, of being misunderstood, of drawing attention that could make things worse. When someone believes they are being watched, even if that belief is rooted in reality, silence becomes a survival strategy. That silence is often misread by the internet as guilt, compliance, or indifference. In reality, it is often the result of trauma layered on top of powerlessness. And while all of this unfolds, another danger remains. Opportunism does not disappear just because one person is arrested. Vulnerable families continue to attract attention. New helpers appear. New narratives form. New promises are made. This is why this case matters far beyond Patrick Roark. It forces a reckoning with how easily compassion can be redirected into control, how quickly storytelling turns into ownership, how fast viewers are encouraged to pick sides instead of asking structural questions. Who is managing the money? Who is protecting the people being filmed? Who has legal authority? And who just sounds convincing? These questions should come before a single dollar changes hands, before a single video is shared, before a single comment declares someone a savior. Because the damage done here did not begin with fraud charges. It began when boundaries were replaced with access, when oversight was replaced with trust, and when suffering became content. The Whittaker case shows what happens when that model collapses. The family does not get rescued. They get scattered. The internet does not get closure. It gets silence. And the systems left behind do not explain themselves for the sake of comfort. They act according to policy, law, and risk, whether or not the public understands. So where does that leave us now? It leaves us with responsibility. Responsibility to stop treating vulnerable lives as open source material. Responsibility to demand transparency before donating. Responsibility to recognize that help without structure can become harm. Most importantly, it leaves us with the responsibility to let this story change how we engage with the next one. Because there will be a next one, another family, another viral moment, another flood of well-meaning attention. The question is whether we will repeat the same mistakes or whether the fallout from this case will finally teach us something lasting. In the final part, we're going to talk about what ethical support actually looks like in 2026, what real protection requires, and what it means to care without crossing the line into exploitation. Before moving on, ask yourself this: if accountability doesn't undo the damage, what does justice actually look like for families like the Whittakers? Share your thoughts in the comments. If there is any meaning left to pull from everything that has happened, it has to live here in what comes after the arrest, after the outrage, after the headlines cool. Because once the courtroom lights dim and the internet moves on, the Whittakers are still here. still aging, still separated, still living with consequences that cannot be argued away in comment sections. This is where we stop asking who was right and start asking what responsibility actually looks like now. Real accountability doesn't end with handcuffs. It begins with boundaries. And boundaries are exactly what the Whittakers never had when their lives became public property. Cameras came first. Money followed. Oversight came last, if at all. That order matters. Ethical help works in reverse. Ethical help starts with protection, not exposure. It starts with professionals, not personalities. It starts with systems designed to safeguard vulnerable people, even when those safeguards are inconvenient, unglamorous, or slow. And that's the hardest part for the internet to accept, because ethical care is boring. It doesn't produce viral clips. It doesn't offer dramatic before and after shots. It doesn't give viewers a sense of ownership over someone else's life. Ethical care looks like paperwork, case managers, medical evaluations, restricted access, confidentiality. It looks like people being told no for their own safety. For years, viewers were conditioned to believe access meant caring, that watching meant helping, that sending money through a familiar face was better than waiting for institutions. But this case exposes the flaw in that thinking. When help depends on a personality, it collapses when that personality fails. When help depends on content, it incentivizes suffering. When help depends on public sympathy, it becomes vulnerable to manipulation. The Whittakers didn't need to be famous to be protected. They needed structure long before attention arrived. So what does ethical support look like in 2026? It looks like refusing to donate through personal accounts tied to individuals, no matter how convincing the story sounds. It looks like asking who has legal authority, not who has the loudest platform. It looks like respecting privacy, even when curiosity feels justified. It also looks like understanding that silence can be protective, not because nothing matters, but because something does. The absence of updates about Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy is not proof of neglect. It is evidence that the system has finally drawn a line the internet is not allowed to cross. That line exists because what happened before crossing it caused harm. And yes, that silence is painful, especially for Betty and Larry. Their grief is not theoretical. It isn't a debate topic. It is daily. It is waking up in a house that no longer reflects the life they lived. It is carrying the weight of caregiving without the people who gave that caregiving meaning. But here is the uncomfortable truth we have to hold alongside that grief. Protection does not always feel like kindness. Safety does not always feel like comfort. Sometimes it feels like loss. And acknowledging that does not mean the intervention was wrong. It means the situation was already broken long before anyone filmed it. This is why the question, was it protection or punishment, is not as simple as people want it to be. For Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, protection may mean stability, care, and dignity they never had before. For Betty and Larry, the same intervention feels like punishment because it dismantled the only life they knew. Both things can be true at the same time. The mistake is thinking we need to choose one narrative and erase the other. The Whittaker story is not a morality play with heroes and villains neatly assigned. It is a case study in what happens when vulnerability meets attention without safeguards, when poverty meets platforms, when compassion meets capitalism. Patrick Roar's arrest is not the end of that lesson. It is the clearest warning the internet has received so far. It tells us this: helping without accountability can become exploitation. Visibility without protection creates risk. And good intentions do not cancel real harm. So here's where this series stands. We will not chase rumors. We will not platform unverified claims. We will not encourage contact, visits, or access to the family. What we will do is continue to focus on verified developments, legal outcomes, and systemic issues that matter beyond one case. And we will keep asking the questions that actually protect people. Who controls the money? Who controls access? Who benefits when suffering becomes content? Because if this story is ever going to mean something more than tragedy, it has to change how we respond the next time a vulnerable family appears on our screens. The Whittakers are not a cautionary tale for curiosity. They're a warning about unchecked compassion. And if we take that warning seriously, then maybe, just maybe, the damage done here will prevent harm somewhere else. Before you go, leave a comment with your thoughts. Not speculation, not rumors, just your honest answer to this. What responsibility do viewers have when watching someone else's suffering? That answer matters more than any update ever will. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.